Hi, welcome to A Push with Lennox, and today we're going to be looking at the road to the American Revolution. That's right, we're going to look at the specific causes that is going to lead the English colonists to dissolve their relationship with Great Britain, which eventually leads to them becoming the United States of America. So come on, let's get started. Now, the first thing you have to realize is this road to the American Revolution is paved with a lot of resentment. And this isn't a resentment that's going to grow throughout the 1760s between the colonists and Great Britain. This resentment started to build up at the end of the French and Indian War for a number of reasons. One of the big ones is because England had to deal with a mounting debt. As I'm sure you're aware, wars cost a lot of money, and the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War, was no different. The English have this huge debt they have to pay off, and they start looking towards the American colonists to pay specifically for the 7 Years' War. Their thought was, we fought in North America to protect the colonists from any advancement by the French or the Native Americans, so they in turn should help pay that back. The colonists, on the other hand, said, hey, we helped fight that war. Why should we foot the whole bill? That's kind of where all this gets started. Now, if it was just about money, they probably could have solved it, but it was also about geography. Following the French-Indian War, the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1763, which afforded all of French land in North America to the English. Well, the colonists saw this as an incredible opportunity to move further west for adventure or new lands and all this other stuff. But the Native Americans in that region, in the Ohio River Valley, they're like, hey, no, we don't want you here. The Native Americans are going to rise up against the English and the colonists. It's known as Pontiac's Rebellion. And there was some real atrocities on both sides of this rebellion. However, in the end, the English are going to pass the Proclamation of 1763, which creates the Proclamation Line of 1763. This line was put in place with the instructions that no colonists would be allowed to cross over that line going westward, and the Native Americans, all that land west of basically the Appalachian Mountains, would be reserved for them. The English idea was this would maintain the peace. The English recognized that there was no way they had the troops or the money to send over a defense force to protect the colonists from the Native Americans in the new land. So the idea was, let's just keep them separate. In fact, Colin Calloway, who was an author who writes a lot about Native Americans during this time period, said that the Royal Proclamation of 1763 reflected the notion that segregation, not interaction, should characterize Indian-white relations. What he's saying is basically, we just got to keep the two groups apart. As long as they're separate from each other, there's not going to be any problems. Well, how do you keep them separate? I mean, you have people like Daniel Boone leading pioneers into Tennessee, going through the Cumberland Gap, and no one stopped him. So you still see a lot of colonists starting to move into that region. The English, though, say they have the right to bring them back if they can catch them. So tension along that line is going to exist for a while. On top of that, when the war ended, and with this thought that not only do we need to keep the colonists from advancing westward, we also have to start looking at them to build our revenue up. The idea of salutary neglect comes to an end. Leading up to the French-Indian War, I'm sure you'll remember, there were laws in place regarding trade between Great Britain and the colonies called the Navigation Acts. But more often than not, these acts were often ignored. On top of that, locally in the colonies, self-government was starting to grow. The colonists were starting to govern themselves. The colonists were even taxing themselves. Well, after the French-Indian War, that's all going to change because salutary neglect is going to be shut down. One final foundation for resentment is going to be the English troops in the colonies. Now, they just put in the proclamation line. Somebody has to protect it. Someone has to defend that line on both sides. So the British troops are going to stay there in order to do that. The big problem that the colonists had, well, a couple big problems they had. Number one, they didn't think that it was legal or proper to have a standing army in times of peace. Well, the Treaty of Paris of 1763 and the negotiation with Pontiac after Pontiac's rebellion is going to lead to a period of peace. So they expected the soldiers to leave. They're not going to leave. So that's one cause of resentment. Another cause is the smugglers are going to be in a little bit of trouble. You see, mercantilism between Great Britain and the colonies had been around since the beginning. We know the Navigation Acts had been around since about the mid-1650s. Well, what you started seeing happen to get around some of those laws they were enforcing, a lot of people in the colonies started to make a lot of money smuggling goods outside of the reach of Great Britain. For instance, one of the Navigation Acts said that any trade ship that leaves the colonies has to stop in Great Britain before it goes anywhere else. Well, you had smugglers who were bypassing that. And this had been a problem all along. It was a problem that England chose to overlook during salutary neglect. That all started to change during the French Indian War in about 1781, when the writs of assistance were put in place, saying that British officials had the legal right to search any business it wanted to, even if it didn't have any cause to think that they were smugglers. So you kind of got that tension building. Now you got more soldiers in the colonies that, could actually tie into maybe stopping smuggling. So successful smugglers like John Hancock there on the right are kind of concerned that England is really starting to enforce its authority within the colonies. Finally, let's get back to that big thing that I talked about at the beginning. Money. The war was very expensive, and Parliament starts looking at the colonies as an avenue for taxation to raise revenue, not only to finance the military that's in the colonies that the colonists don't want, but also to start paying off that war debt. You're going to see a series of taxation laws be passed, everything from the Sugar Act of 64 to the Townshend Act of 67, all with the intent of collecting some form of taxation from the colonies. Now, the Sugar Act was passed in 1764. This was an import tax. And what's fascinating to me about the Sugar Act was it wasn't a new tax on foreign sugar. In 1733, the Molasses Act was passed, which was also a tax on imported sugar. Now, this tax is not going to necessarily affect a lot of the colonists because as an import tax, those who are buying sugar directly from traders are going to be vendors in the colonies, merchants. But what they will do is once they pay that import tax, they will pass that on to the colonists who are buying the sugar. You're also going to see, as a result of the Sugar Act, a stricter enforcement of the navigation laws that have been in place, like I said, since the 1650s, and a crackdown on smuggling, whether it's through the writs of assistance, whether it's through, the soldiers, the English forces that are there searching ships, whatever. They're going to start cracking down on smugglers. And here's the other thing. They're going to institute admiralty courts, meaning if you're caught smuggling, you will be taken on trial in England. You won't get a jury trial of your peers here in the colonies. That's going to cause more resentment, more tension. It's really going to be the Stamp Act, though, that's going to start driving discourse throughout the colonies. The Stamp Act was an internal tax, meaning it was just a tax in the colonies. And what England started doing, what Parliament did with this act, was they put a tax on the printing of all legal documents in the colonies. And the way it would work is you would pay a tax on, if you're getting a lease signed. That lease would be printed, you would pay a tax on it, and it would get the stamp of the taxation. So you can see on the right there, it looks like shillings, pence. What's that? 2 shillings, 6 pence. That was the tax on whatever document this was to print. There's going to be a huge resistance to this. You're going to see the colonists start to rise up. Groups will start to form to boycott or protest this tax. And that's going to lead to several groups being formed. The mantra of the boycotts, of the protest, is this line right here. No taxation without representation. first time in American history that this line has been used, and it's going to be used over and over and over again. But this is the first time. And the idea behind this comes from the Magna Carta, the root of it. And in the Magna Carta, it says that there should not be taxation without the consent of the governed. Meaning, if Parliament wants to issue a tax, whether it's a stamp tax, a sugar tax, whatever, they need to get the consent of those that it affects, and in this case, the colonies. Well, the colonies had no say in this. You see, over in the colonies, you had self-government. You knew you had local governments, and they were taxing each other already. It wasn't like there were never taxes in the colonies, but the taxes that existed were generated by the local governments. These taxes I'm talking about, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, they're going to be generated by Parliament. And Parliament did that without any representation from the colonies. Now, honestly, the colonists really didn't want representation in Parliament because they knew that they would be outnumbered. I mean, send over a couple colonists into the grand halls of Parliament, and they're just going to be shouted down. The colonists felt we don't need representation in Parliament because we have our own representation here in the colonies. We have our own local representation. And that's who has the power to tax us, not Parliament. Are you kind of seeing where the conflict is rising from? Virginia House of Burgesses is going to pass a series of resolves introduced by Patrick Henry, calling out Great Britain for the Stamp Act. They basically said that we have the same freedoms or liberties, privileges, and immunities as the citizens of all of Great Britain. We are British. And that taxation can't be imposed by anybody without our consent. That is part of being English. And we didn't give our consent for the Stamp Act. We didn't give our consent for the Sugar Act or whatever. You can't do it without us saying, hey, it's okay. And one step further, only the Virginia General Assembly has the authority to tax the people in Virginia. We almost got a little bit of a Declaration of Independence right here. The Virginians are saying we are British, but we govern ourselves. The British government has no authority on us. And so hopefully you're kind of seeing how we're slowly starting to roll down this road and what's leading us down this road. The colonies are going to create what's known as the Stamp Act Congress. Now, this is the first time that all the colonies have come together since the Albany Plan, that happened right before the French Indian War. And they're going to claim that taxation without representation is illegal. And as they're not represented in Parliament, the Stamp Act, illegal. Now, Parliament's going to come back and say, whoa, hold on. You are represented. It's called virtual representation. You see, when every member of Parliament joins the government, they take an oath to act in the best interest of all Englishmen. Well, the colonists are Englishmen. And so when Parliament passes a law, they say they're doing that in the best interest of the colonists as English citizens. David Dulaney calls hogwash on that. He's, in his considerations of the propriety of imposing taxes, he's going to argue, kind of what we saw with the Virginia General Assembly, that the colonies are their own separate political community. While they are still English citizens, they have their own government over here in the colonies, and that is completely separate from Parliament, which means Parliament has no authority over the colonies. How do you think England feels about that? I mentioned some resistance organizations that are going to grow. Sons of Liberty. This is one you need to know. This was a resistance movement, an organization of men in the colonies. It was a secret organization, but it really wasn't a secret. And their primary tool to fight against taxation was intimidation of English tax collectors. Now, they will run mass protest and try to boycott British goods, stuff like that. But what they tried to do is intimidate those who are collecting the taxes to either get them to quit or just leave. And so that's what happens when you see an article like this in a newspaper. This was published in 1765 during the Stamp Act conflict, and you can say the true-born sons of liberty are desired to meet under the Liberty Tree at 12 o'clock this day to hear the public resignation of Andrew Oliver, distributor of stamps. Andrew Oliver is a tax collector, an English authority, and he is being called out by the Sons of Liberty to come to the center of town and resign his position. If he doesn't, does it say anything there about what would happen if he doesn't? Not in print. But if you look at the previous picture, you see the actions that the Sons of Liberty would often use, called tar and feathering, where they would literally take hot tar, pour it on these tax collectors and feather them, maybe carry them through town on a rail if they refuse to quit. So your choice is, as a tax collector, either quit, like they ask in the paper, or face the wrath of the Sons of Liberty. All this takes place, and guess what? Parliament repeals the Stamp Act. Is that a good idea if you're the English Parliament to kind of back down like that? I would say no. Several members of Parliament had always had different perceptions on how the colonists should be treated. Robert Walpole, and this is well before the French and Indian War, he said that if no restrictions were placed on the colonies, they would flourish. That's salutary neglect in a nutshell. Leave them alone. They're going to do great. If they do great, we'll do great. But as we move beyond the war, as we move into the parliamentary members who now have to deal with this surmounting debt from the war that, from their perception, they spent defending the colonies, they have a completely different perspective. George Grenville said that the nation Britain has to run itself into an immense debt to give them, the colonies, this protection. And now they're called upon to contribute just a small share towards the public expense. We defended them. They should pay for it. William Pitt, he's going to say, let the sovereign authority of this country over the colonies be asserted as strong terms can be devised. Let's get in there. And we need to extend every point of legislation. We need to govern them in a way that we bind their trade, confine their manufacturers, and exercise every power we have. Can you see the shift between pre-French and Indian War Parliament and post-French Indian War Parliament? Completely different perspectives. So what Parliament's going to do next is pass a series of legislative acts. They are by no means done. Yes, they repealed the Stamp Act, but they're going to start taxing a whole lot of other things. But before they do that, they pass the Declaratory Act. And I can get into all the fancy talk and everything, but bottom line, it says this: we're Parliament, we're the government, we declare that we can pass any law with regards to the colonies that we want at any time. We're declaring our authority over the colonies. On top of that, they're going to appoint Charles Townshend as the Chancellor of the Exchequer. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but it sounds kind of cool. Exchequer. The Exchequer, that's the Treasury. Charles Townshend now is in charge of the money for Great Britain, and he's going to say he's going to implement taxes on the colonies. They're called the Townshend Acts. They're passed in 1767, and it's a tax on imports. And it's a tax on paper, paint, lead, glass, and tea. Notice, the Sugar Act, also a tax on imports. Does everybody use sugar all the time? No, you can probably avoid using that. The Stamp Act, a tax on legal documents. Is everyone actually going to have legal documents? Probably not, so you're not hitting everybody. But look, paper, paint, glass, tea, lead, these are everyday use items. This is going to affect everybody in the colonies. And this is seen more as like a direct tax. This is a tax they're going to have to pay no matter what they buy out of this group. There obviously is going to be resistance to this. And why wouldn't there be? There was resistance to the Stamp Act, and look what happened. They got it repealed. Same thing with the Townshend Acts. John Dickinson is going to publish a series of essays called Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. And he's basically going to make the argument that the liberties of the colonists are at least just being threatened, if not being taken away. And if that's the case, if everyone is convinced of this, they have the right to resist this by force. And he actually ties it back to previous times throughout the government of England where their liberties had been threatened and force had been used to win them back. On top of that, the colonists are going to create these agreements amongst themselves, these non-importation or these non-consumption agreements. Non-importation, if they want to tax imports, let's just stop importing stuff. Let's stop getting stuff from England. And if there is stuff here from England, non-consumption, let's just not use it. This is what we call a boycott. Just stop buying English goods. Another group, like the Sons of Liberty, is going to come out called the Daughters of Liberty during this time. But don't worry, the Sons of Liberty are still around. They're going to go back to their ways of intimidation and protest and stuff like that. And the Daughters of Liberty are actually going to form together to work on reducing the dependence on British goods. For example, they're going to start making their own fabric. It's called homespun fabric. And in doing that, colonists won't be reliant on English fabric. And it almost became like a badge of honor to wear homespun fabric and to be seen in homespun fabric. The Daughters of Liberty are also going to organize boycotts of British goods and everything. So what does all this do? What does what's the purpose of boycotting? I mean, obviously they're not going to be paying taxes, but how is this going to end all this taxation? Well, one way is by boycotting these goods. It's not going to hurt Parliament directly. Who it's going to hurt is English merchants. If English merchants can't sell their goods over here, they might go to Parliament and complain, saying, hey, all this pressure you're putting on the colonists, it's hurting us back home, so back off. And that's what they're kind of hoping that's going to happen. Another thing that's introduced by Townshend and the British authority, they're going to send more troops into the colonies. You got to look at what the Sons of Liberty are doing. They want to protect, or the troops are there to protect the English officials who are coming in and collecting the taxes and all this other stuff. That's going to cause a little bit of a problem. The increase of troops in the colonies is what's going to lead to the Boston Massacre in 1770. And the Boston Massacre was a direct confrontation between these British troops and a very rowdy Bostonian mob. Paul Revere is going to use the Boston Massacre as a way to propagandize an independence movement. And that's going to be right here in his depiction. This drawing is going to go to all the colonial newspapers. And the idea is, man, if that could happen in Boston, it could happen here too. We need to maybe start banding together. First bloodshed of the American independence movement. I usually refer to the 1760s as the age of protest, but moving into the 1770s, we're moving into the age of bloodshed. What's very interesting is that the soldiers were put on trial in Boston, defended by John Adams, cousin of Samuel Adams, who was a leader of the Sons of Liberty, and they were found not guilty. It's often overlooked, but that's a very important point and something I want you to remember for future discussions. So what happens? Parliament repeals most of the Townshend Acts. Repeals the tax on paper, paint, lead, and glass. However, they maintain the tax on tea. And even though they repealed all these taxes, Parliament still said, don't forget, the Declaratory Act is still in play. Just because we're not taxing you doesn't mean we can't in the future. That's going to lead us to the end of the 1760s, and it would almost feel like the coast is clear, like maybe we've reached a point of We got a good place now with Great Britain. We can just progress on. But like we've said before, we know history. It's not clear. It's starting to get a lot stormier out there. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. Hope you learned something. If not, remember, rewind, watch it again. See you around.